Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you guys for joining the 990s podcast hosted by yours truly, Kevin Thompson, founder and CEO of 99 Capital Group. Thank you guys for joining us. As I always say, subscribe to the channel. As I always say, go and get my book, MLB to CFP, live on Apple and Amazon. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can email us at info@9icapitalgroup.com. Send us your questions, or you can go to the website at www.9icapitalgroup.com. Schedule an appointment. As you know, we're here to do what? Educate, empower, and engage. And today we're talking with Emily Flitter, the author of The White Wall: How Big Finance Bankrupts Black America. We're going to go deep. We're going to go deep, fellas, and it's going to be a serious conversation, and it might be painful for some folks. So please take a seat, relax. Let's get it. We have Emily Flitter, New York Times journalist. Thank you for joining us. And also, she is the author of The White Wall: How Big Finance Bankrupts Black America. Emily, thank you for joining the podcast today, my friend.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Man, so reading your book, I was enlightened by a lot of things. We can talk about the JP Morgans of the world. We can talk about the Wells Fargos of the world. We can even talk about the Bank of Americas of the world that over the last decade have paid out hundreds of millions of dollars anti-discrimination lawsuits. But yet, there's no media recognition of any of this stuff. No one knows what's going on behind the doors because people sign NDAs. People are told to keep quiet in this industry. And to me, no pun intended, but it's like a black eye in this industry because no one wants to admit to the inequities inside of the financial world to a degree. But your book does a phenomenal job of bringing a lot of that out. So my first question is around just the industry in itself. We can talk about the mass grave that's on Wall Street. We can talk about all the banks and the industries that have taken advantage of the entire system. And one thing that I've learned from you is that every time I hear a commercial where someone says, we have 150 years of experience, my first inclination is, interesting. I wonder what that background looks like. So talk to me first and foremost on what got you to, what made you write this book, and what was your purpose, your sole purpose behind it?
So the reason that I wrote the book is that when I heard story after story about how Black employees at big banks were treated and how Black customers were being treated, I realized that they were not all individual one-off incidents. And it would take a sustained look and a sustained period of observation to really capture the context in which all of these individual things happen. After the book came out, I gave a talk in Cleveland, and the moderator of the talk, who was brilliant, was Danielle Sidnor. And at that time, she was the outgoing president of the Cleveland NAACP.
Okay.
And she had been a financial advisor at a couple different places. Linda Friedman, who's in my book, she's a lawyer, and she's the one who brought all these anti-discrimination cases that you referenced, called Danielle and said, I need your help. We're putting together a new discrimination lawsuit against the bank that you work for, and I want you to be the lead plaintiff. And Danielle was like, look, honestly, I am having problems at this bank. I think it's just my boss is like a bad boss. And I feel like I can succeed if I can just find somebody better to work with. And I don't want to get involved in something that groups me in with people who are helpless, who can't actually overcome this. Starts just like laying out all of the problems that she's having. And Linda starts finishing her sentences for her. And that to me really sums up what the difference is, even in like if you're going through it, between thinking that you're alone and that the problem is like you or your boss or some combination that's very personal. I felt like that problem needed to be observed in a long form. And that was my goal.
Well, you mentioned a lot of different things, especially with the arbitration panels. That was kind of disheartening to me because I don't know how a lot of that works because I was in the industry, and my experience with the industry is exactly what you mentioned. For example, I'm not going to name any names because I'm just not that type of person. But again, there was entities that would get referrals from a website, and those referrals, if they had certain names, would go to certain individuals. So for example, if a Shaniqua Jackson or a Shonda Hanson or whatever, those would come to people like myself because, hey, and that's the fallacy of this whole entire thing. It's like, I've always said this, and I said it to one of my guy friends before. I said, do you think if that person was Dr. Shaniqua Jackson, would you get that same referral? And my inclination is no, you wouldn't. But I digress. I don't understand why the industry is so numb and just lets a lot of this stuff fly by. Is it because it's unconscious? Is it because it just doesn't know any better? I don't know. But one thing you mentioned was the arbitration panels and how the council members in those arbitration panels lack diversity. And I've always said, especially in our criminal justice system, if we're judged by a panel of our peers, well, a lot of the African Americans in the criminal justice system are judged by 12 white members. And I'm not saying this to be argumentative, but if it was switched, how comfortable would you feel if it was 12 black people judging that said white person? But I digress. But again, going back to your question, or going back to the advisory councils, how do you think the lack of diversity affects the outcomes of these cases, especially concerning racial discrimination in the financial sector?
Well, I think you have touched on a huge problem that I have thought about. I think this problem actually could use another entire book. And I haven't written it yet,
Yeah.
but maybe I will.
Yeah.
I think that when you have a civil court system or like the arbitration forums, which are supposed to replace the courts and be more efficient, you have a system where basically mostly old white men are deciding what facts and what evidence is real and how much it counts for.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not like those are decisions that can affect the outcome of cases. They're really important, and they are not there's no like checks or balances, especially on an arbitration panel.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a case where somebody says, I think that I was discriminated based on my race, and here are 3 of the best examples of how I was treated and why I think it's racism, and you have a panel of 3 retired financial advisors who are all in their 70s who say, well, that doesn't seem like racism to me. Well, how does that person's experience make them qualified to say what racism is? And how much thought have they even given to it? Since my book came out, I've had a story come to me by a woman who was claiming workplace discrimination, and the response that she got after she filed the claim was, well, we don't think that guy is racist because he's kind of an asshole to everyone. Pardon my French.
Yeah. And that's fine. On this podcast, we let it all fly out.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead.
But even then, I mean, I can't remember if I mentioned this story in my book, but this was a story written by one of my colleagues at the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. Treasury's Bureau of the Mint had an incident in 2020 or 2021 where an employee who was Black found a noose on his desk. And which, oh my God, what do we all know that means?
Yeah.
Well, the Bureau investigated and decided that there was no evidence of racial discrimination.
Oh, just a noose.
Like, whose job, who gets to decide that that isn't a racist symbol and gesture? Like, that just defies common sense.
Defies logic, defies common sense. And what also I wanted to talk about is now we have all of these arbitration panels, and then you force these people to sign these NDAs. I don't understand how. I mean, I get it because banks and the legislative bodies of this United States of America, they're in bed together. Oh, we're going to bail you out whenever you do something bad, Wells Fargo. And by the way, I'm going to continue to say Wells Fargo because I can't stand them one bit, and I'm sorry. But we're going to bail you out, Wells Fargo or Bank of America or Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, from all your bad actions. But yet you have the power to force someone to sign an NDA, give them a settlement, and then say, you can never speak about this again. You can never speak about the illegalities and the inequities you faced in our business. What say you about that? Like, can we talk about like how these agreements and accountability act towards transparency, and how these banks are just using these to provide leverage against people?
Well, here's what I would say about that. There has been a movement to end the practice of gagging people who have gone through these settlements, but only if the case is related to sexual harassment and not racial discrimination. What does that say to you? Yeah. You know what I mean? Important. It's like we already, there's literally a new law that was passed within the last 2 years, and it went into effect at the beginning of 2023, I think, that says that if you are an employee at a company and you have faced sexual harassment or abuse, the company isn't allowed to gag you anymore. It speaks for itself that companies have not agreed to end that practice where racial discrimination is concerned. Yeah. And in doing the research for this book and writing the book, what I found was that big companies are so concerned about the legal liability that they face in these situations and how expensive it can be, that they just can't, there's a corporate reflex, which is embedded in our system to say, like, we didn't do anything wrong, we're perfect, everything's fine, there's nothing to see here. And I think that has really prevented change from taking hold inside these companies. Just look at any kind of corporate malfeasance. I mean, look at Boeing. The whole thing, the whole effort that companies make when they're facing accusations of wrongdoing is, let's minimize it, let's make it go away. We just want to get it over with as quickly as possible. I don't think there's no such thing as soul searching in the corporate world, or at least not that we've seen.
Yeah, it's all about shareholder wealth, and I get it. I mean, it's the Milton Friedman economy versus the Adam Smith invisible hand and all of that jazz. And you mentioned the NDAs, and you also mentioned affirmative defense inside of your book, where a pass is given to an entity by the court that says that bad actions in a case of an entity shall not be liable. These companies have been using that, saying, well, yeah, we did this, but it's not, we're going to use this tactic, affirmative defense, and ultimately it washes away. Can you walk me through that a little bit, or do you have any understanding around that?
What the affirmative defense is for these kinds of cases is, somebody who's feeling bad at work wants to say, I am working in a hostile environment. The company can avoid being liable for a claim like that by having policies and procedures in place to report discrimination and ameliorate any problems that employees are facing. So if you put down on paper and demonstrate that you've shown employees adequately, the details of this policy, here's what to do if you're facing harassment or discrimination, here's where you can go, here's how we will fix it. And all you have to do is show that you've done that. as a company, you can have a much higher chance of being able to completely defend yourself in court.
And what's so funny is that you mentioned this a lot in your book, where they'll just say, "Hey, come talk to us." Oh, you talked to us. Oh, you sent this up from an email back in at 2:04 in the morning, and we got this, and a lot of them lied about it, like when they received it and all that other stuff, whether it be the J.P. Morgans. And by the way, that I think it was J.P. Morgan. And again, I don't want to besmirch any big bank out there, but the uh when the black people would come in and they would have a, "Hey, please use caution." You use that in your book, to please use caution. So a lot of that felt like a gut punch, right? Like they say, "God, like, why are they consistently putting us in a box where a guy goes out and he has $50,000 in his account, and then he wants to withdraw 30,000 to buy a rental car, and the next thing you know, no, we're not going to let you do it because your driver's license doesn't look like you, or it's out of date, or your address on this says this, so we're going to give you some problems." And I'm not saying it's not something that's in the white community as well, but it seems like it's something that's more inside of the black community because of a lack of trust in regards to whether it be the banks or whether it be our community itself. So that's just my 2 cents. What say you on that?
Well, again, I think that the reason that I published those emails was that they showed in the cases where Black people were described, that the suspicion over what the Black potential customer wanted to do was based on the person's description.
Yeah.
So the difference between, and I guess just for our audience's sake, I'll explain, these are emails that bank tellers were sending to each other to warn each other about suspicious people coming into their branches. And in the case of a big bank like Chase, JP Morgan Chase, you can have a lot of branches of the same bank close together in an area. So these were tellers in the New York tri-state area who were saying like, "Okay, this guy came into this branch, watch out for him. He might come into your branch." In some cases, they were saying this person presented a bank card that has already been reported stolen. But in the cases where Black potential customers walked in, it was more like, this guy came in with a check and I didn't think it was real, so I didn't cash it. Well,
Yeah.
what was the evidence on which you decided that the check wasn't real? There's no evidence. It's just that the guy has dreadlocks or he's wearing a hoodie, and he's Black. So
Hey, I'm all three, by the way.
so that's racial profiling. And it's what disadvantages a customer before the customer ever does anything or opens his or her mouth. And that's what I was trying to point out.
To me, the industry's kind of sick. You mentioned and you mentioned Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction, and I've been reading that lately as well. And you guys have a lot of parallels inside of that. Phenomenal. The Ghetto Loans, the Ghetto Loans, and the fact that they even named them Ghetto Loans is just beyond my recollection. I just get so angry about that. But the Ghetto Loans, what people don't understand is this, and I know you get it because you've written about it. Just because you decide to provide restitution to a community, and I believe it was Wells Fargo for $175 million to 30,000 victims of the Ghetto Loans was it in Washington, D.C., Baltimore area?
Yeah.
Baltimore, Maryland?
Yeah, Baltimore.
So guess what? That's $5,800. $5,800. Thank you for $5,800, but you have wrecked my life to having access to the financial industry for nobody knows how long. My credit score's been wrecked. I don't have access to capital, but you've given me $5,800 to basically make me feel better. And by the way, thank you for foreclosing on my home. I appreciate that. People don't understand that a lot of these quote unquote, we gave this money out to them. It's pennies on the dollar for what actually happens in someone's life.
When I looked at some of these big discrimination cases against the banks brought by employees, you know, if you look at the individual stories of the people who are members of the class who were discriminated against, you'll find stories of divorce and even worse, sickness and death that are all stemming from the way these individuals were treated at work. The impacts are huge, and I think that's why why it's so important to keep talking about this. And you know, one of the things that you've been saying in as a reaction to my book is that you're feeling like, what can we possibly do? And I don't have the answers. I was told by my publisher to come up with a proposal. I was like, first I was like, is it something about HR? Like, should I be learning about how HR works? And then by the time I finished doing the reporting, I was like, oh no, it's much bigger. And that is why I've come up with not come up with, it's not my idea, but that's why I bring up reparations in the book, because we need to talk about this on that scale, like on such a massive scale. And I think talking about it, even you and me talking about it today, we that's really important, and we have to keep talking about it, because the sort of forces of capitalism that are enacting or are acting on the financial landscape are always going to want us to stop talking about this.
1000%.
So yeah.
And I've always said that I don't care how big their hurdle is. If I'm in a race with someone, and let's just say it's me and there's a bunch of different guys, I just want to know how high my hurdle is. And if their hurdles are lower, that's fine by me, but just tell me how high my hurdle is so I can know how hard I need to train to get over that hurdle. Because I know once those hurdles are removed, the game is over. The game is absolutely over. And my thought process around how we can fix this is, one, more, of course, more Black executives. Meritocracy, I'm all for it. And my man Tyrone Ross said it, is that it's not about equality anymore, because yes, everybody's equal, everybody's on the same playing field. It's about equity. It's about me having the ability to have that front row seat inside of the concert. Yes, everybody can get into the concert, but now can I have a front row seat? And I want to be able to have a front row seat and have ownership. And that's why I have my own company, because now that allows me to say, okay, now with ownership, what can I do to bring others up with me so they can not only learn and possibly go off and do their own thing and build up others as well? And that's how you build up a community, and that's how you build up a society. That's just my take. I'm just hoping to do my part in all of this, to have conversations like this, because this is what's powerful. Your book, again, The White Wall, How Big Finance Bankrupts Black America, was a phenomenal thing. But I'm going to say this before we go, is that it was consistently telling me, like, and I'm going to say this, as an African-American individual, you need to be in a good space before you read it. Is that fair? Is that fair?
Absolutely. In fact, I was telling you before, when we were talking before we started recording, that the paperback version of the book actually has a foreword that's basically a trigger warning, because I heard from so many readers that they were traumatized by reading the book. And I certainly don't want people to kind of like waltz in feeling super calm and think that they're not going to feel distress. It's a very distressing subject. And like, I want to say, in a way, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry for bringing this to light. It's terrible that it exists, but we need to keep talking about it. But you're absolutely right. For anyone out there considering reading the book, take a deep breath, make yourself a cup of hot chocolate, get a blanket, make yourself really comfortable, and put it down and go outside when it gets too bad. One person wrote to me and said, I was on the treadmill and I started reading the book and I had like a panic attack and had to stop. So
I will say that because I introduced the book to one of my clients, and she was, she's recently in between jobs. And I said, you know what? This is not for you right now. I said, when you get your job, when you get your income, when you get in a good space, then I want you to open that book up. For right now, not right now. This is not for you. And I appreciate you bringing this to light, because a lot of people, like you mentioned, the Floridians or whomever it may be, are trying to not have this conversation because it makes them feel a certain way. It makes them feel like victims. And I am not about victimization. I'm about bringing each other up and having great conversations, because either side you're on, and I'm not saying anybody needs to pick a side. I want to understand you. Just like the lady last a couple of weeks ago when we were having this conversation, and it was in the FAIQ about DEI and Wall Street shedding DEI. And this is a great conversation. Wall Street was shedding DEI. And she was like, what about my son? What about, as a white woman, she said, what about my son and him getting overlooked because of these disenfranchised people? Well, I want to understand how you feel, because now you understand how those disenfranchised people feel. So it's all about having an understanding and being empathetic. And I'm glad, Emily, I've had you on the call today, because you understand the empathy around what's going on in the world of finance, and you put it out there for the world to see. And any last words you would like to kind of use to emphasize the book, and maybe your grand idea on what we could theoretically do? And I know you just said, I don't know what the answers are, but outside of reparations, what other things do you think that we may need to consider?
Well, I really strongly believe that the conversation needs to be about reparations, and that the big financial firms have to be involved in that. And I think that will help them get over the hump of talking about all of this stuff. But also, I think that there are things that are going on right now in the financial industry. For instance, Citigroup has been one of the banks that has tried to change its practices since George Floyd was murdered, and all the big banks.
JP Morgan.
JP Morgan's was sort of like, here's $30 billion that we're pledging. I go through that in detail in the book, and I'm not going to do it right here, but Citi was more, here's what we're doing, and they followed up and they audited themselves and tried to figure out whether what they were doing was working. And they're continuing to kind of evolve what they're doing, and kudos to them. I don't think that anyone's perfect, but they're showing over a sustained period of time that they're trying. The federal regulators have a project going called Project Reach, where they're asking the big banks what they can do to change rules so that the banks don't feel like they can't lend to people who have, the historical inputs that disadvantage them, even though they have done nothing wrong. And so I think the other thing that I would say is that if you're out there, if you're participating in the financial industry, or if you're just a consumer, go beyond what you see in advertisements and look for programs and institutions like CDFIs, community development financial organizations, that may be trying to lend differently, because there are people out there working on really, really highly technical ways to change how lending works to include more people.
Well, you're phenomenal. Keep up the fight. I truly appreciate you. I truly appreciate what you put out there. Thank you so much for joining the 980s podcast today. The White Wall, How Big Finance Bankrupts Black America. Wonderful read. Get yourself in a good position. Take it all in. And again, if you have any questions, I'd love to have this conversation further on another podcast. Maybe we can go a little bit more in depth, but today was just a high level overview, because I wanted people to understand your book and understand your side and how you're feeling. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
We just had Emily Flitter of New York Times here on the 980s podcast. She talked about her book, The White Wall, How Big Finance Bankrupts Black America. We talked about the systemic issues in regards to the banking industry, JP Morgan's, the Wells Fargo's, the Bank of America's, and their historical context on how they have ties to certain issues that have come up in the past and how they're trying to rectify those issues. And we didn't get to the other things, but we will get to those other things in another podcast. Trust me, we will get to those things as well. And then finally, thank you guys for joining us. As I always say, subscribe to the channel. As I always say, go and get my book, MLB to CFP, live on Apple and Amazon. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can email us at info@9icapitalgroups.com. Send us your questions. You can go to the website at www.9icapitalgroup.com. Schedule an appointment. As you know, we're here to do what? Educate, empower, and engage. And today, Emily Flitter, author, New York Times, wonderful book. Be in a good space before you pick that book up, because you have to get your mind right, because it's a hard hitter, my friends. It's a hard hitter, and it's gonna have a lot of facts out there. It's gonna make you think, man, this industry's worse than you thought. But again, we're all going in the right direction. Everything's for a reason, and I want everybody to stay in the fight. Stay humble, stay safe. I'll see you again soon.